The cold Omega heated the Alpha King's bed each night, not knowing he slept outside the door. Kale woke to the sound of chains being dragged across stone, and for one terrible moment he thought they were coming for him again. His heart slammed against his ribs before he realized the sound was only the palace gates opening far below his window. He was safe. For now. 3 days ago, his family had sold him. Not to a stranger, not to a traitor in some back alley, but to the palace itself, to the court of the most feared Alpha King in the 6 kingdoms. King Draven of Ashvale was a name that made grown soldiers go quiet. He was said to have crushed a rebellion with his bare hands, to have never once shown mercy to an enemy, to have buried 2 wives and never wept at either funeral. And now Kale, a disgraced Omega from a family that had lost everything, was to be his. The carriage ride to the palace had taken 2 full days. Kale spent every hour of it staring out the window, memorizing the hills and rivers of his homeland, as though he might never see them again. His mother had not come to say goodbye. His father had signed the papers with a hand that did not shake, and that had hurt more than anything else. Kale was 18 years old, and he had just become property. When the carriage finally stopped inside the palace walls, a woman with sharp eyes and silver hair was waiting for him. She introduced herself as Mira, head of the Omega quarters, and she did not smile. "You are the new Bed Omega," she said, looking him over, the way a farmer inspects livestock. "Do you know what that means?" Kale lifted his chin, refusing to let her see him tremble. "I warm his bed. I have been told." "You warm his bed," Mira repeated, "and you do whatever else he requires of you. The king's needs come before your own, before your comfort, before your pride. Do you understand?" He did not answer. He simply nodded, because his throat had closed too tightly for words. Mira led him through corridors so grand they seemed to belong to a dream rather than a life. Golden chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with battle scenes. Guards stood at every corner, silent and armored, their eyes following Kale, as though he were something dangerous rather than something small and frightened. He kept his gaze on the floor and counted his steps to keep from crying. They arrived at a set of double doors carved with the crest of Ashvale, a wolf standing over a crown. Mira pushed them open without knocking. "This is the king's chamber," she said. "Your chamber, as of tonight. You will sleep here every night. You will keep the room warm and welcoming. You will be ready when he arrives." Kale stepped inside and felt his breath catch despite himself. The room was enormous, larger than his family's entire house had ever been. A fireplace roared at one end, though no one had lit it that he could see. The bed at the center of the room was the largest he had ever laid eyes on, draped in furs the color of midnight, framed by carved wooden pillars that reached toward a ceiling painted with stars. "He will come to you after the sun sets," Mira told him. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look him directly in the eyes unless he permits it. And whatever happens in this room, you do not discuss it with anyone. Is that clear?" "Yes," Kale whispered. Mira studied him a moment longer, something almost like pity flickering across her sharp features before she buried it. "You're young," she said, "younger than the last one. Try to survive it." The last one. The words sent a cold shiver down Kale's spine, but Mira was already turning to leave, her skirts sweeping across the polished floor, and he did not dare ask what had happened to the Omega who came before him. Alone in the enormous chamber, Kale allowed himself, finally, to shake. He sat on the edge of the great bed and pressed his palms against his eyes, willing himself not to weep. He thought of his mother's kitchen, small and warm, filled with the smell of bread. He thought of his younger sister, who did not yet know what had happened to him, who still believed Kale had gone away to study in the capital. He thought of everything he had lost in the span of 3 days, and he let himself grieve for exactly as long as it took the sun outside the window to touch the horizon. Then he stood, wiped his face, and began to prepare the room the way Mira had instructed him. He straightened the furs on the bed. He lit the candles along the walls. He poured a goblet of wine and set it on the table beside the bed. Though his hands trembled so badly, he spilled some of it onto the polished wood. Night fell completely, and Kale sat on the edge of the bed, waiting. He waited through the first hour, back straight, hands folded in his lap, rehearsing in his mind every warning Mira had given him. He waited through the second hour, his shoulders beginning to ache from holding himself so rigidly still. By the third hour, the candles had burned low, and Kale's eyes grew heavy, despite the fear coursing through him. The king never came. Cale woke just before dawn, still sitting upright against the headboard, his neck stiff and sore. The other side of the bed was untouched, the furs still perfectly smooth the way he had left them the night before. For a moment, he simply stared at the empty space beside him, confused. Had the king come and gone while he slept? Had he been too exhausted to notice? But no, the wine goblet still sat exactly where he had placed it, full to the same line. No one had touched it. No one had touched anything in the room at all. Mira arrived not long after sunrise, her expression unreadable as she took in the untouched bed, the burned-down candles, the wine gone slightly warm on the table. "He did not come," Cale said, unsure whether he should feel relieved or afraid. "I can see that," Mira replied, her tone giving nothing away. "It happens sometimes. The king is a busy man. Prepare the room again tonight." Cale wanted to ask more. He wanted to ask if this was normal, if this had happened with the Omega before him, if there was some reason the most powerful man in the Six Kingdoms would go to the trouble of buying an Omega only to leave him sitting alone in an empty bed each night. But Mira's face told him the questions would not be welcome, so he swallowed them down and nodded instead. That night, he prepared the room again. He straightened the furs, lit the candles, poured the wine. He sat on the edge of the bed and waited, though this time the fear had softened into something closer to confusion. By the second hour, his mind had begun wandering instead of racing. By the third, he found himself studying the carved wolf on the bedpost nearest him, tracing its lines with his eyes, wondering what kind of man chose a wolf as his symbol, and then refused to sleep in his own bed. The king did not come that night either, nor the night after that. By the end of the first week, Cale had settled into a strange and lonely routine. Each evening he prepared the king's chamber as though his life depended on it, because for all he knew, it did. Each night he sat waiting in the enormous bed, dressed in the fine silk robes Mira had provided, his hair brushed and his face washed, ready for a man who never arrived. And each morning he woke alone, the room exactly as untouched as he had left it, the wine gone cold and undisturbed. He began to wonder if the king even remembered he existed at all. The other Omegas in the quarters whispered about it when they thought he could not hear. He caught fragments of their conversations in the washrooms and the dining hall. Words like cursed and forgotten, and does he even want an Omega at all? And though none of them said anything to his face, Cale could feel their pity following him through the corridors like a second shadow. It stung more than he expected. He had been prepared to be feared, to be hurt, to be used. He had not been prepared to be ignored. Pride was a strange thing, he learned. He had not wanted this position. He had not asked to be sold, to be given away like a piece of furniture to a man he had never met. And yet some small, foolish part of him had begun to feel wounded, that the man in question could not be bothered to even look at him. He tried not to dwell on it. Instead, he focused on learning the palace, on understanding the strange new world he now lived in. He learned the names of the kitchen staff, who slipped him extra bread when Mira wasn't looking. He learned the quickest routes between the Omega quarters and the royal wing, though he rarely had reason to use them beyond his nightly duties. He learned, slowly, which of the guards nodded politely at him, and which ones stared with open contempt, as though his very presence in the palace offended them. And every night, without fail, he prepared the king's chamber and sat alone in that enormous bed, listening to the wind outside the window and the distant sound of guards changing shifts in the hallway beyond the door. It was on the 9th night that he first noticed the guard. Cale had grown so used to the empty room, so accustomed to his solitary vigil, that he had begun leaving the heavy curtains slightly open to watch the moon rise over the palace gardens. It was during one of these quiet moments, staring out at the silver light on the hedges below, that he heard a small sound from the hallway outside his door. A shift of weight, the faint creak of leather armor. He crossed the room quietly and pressed his ear to the wood. There was someone standing just outside. He could hear the steady, even breathing of a person trying very hard to remain still and silent. A guard, he assumed, posted there for the king's protection, though it seemed strange that a guard would be stationed directly outside a chamber the king himself never used. He almost called out, almost asked who was there, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was Mira's warning, still echoing in his mind, telling him not to ask questions, not to draw attention, to simply survive. He stepped back from the door and returned to the window, and though he strained his ears for the rest of the night, he did not hear the sound again. The next morning, he asked one of the kitchen maids, a cheerful young woman named Elowyn, whether guards were always posted outside the king's private chamber. Elowyn glanced around before answering, lowering her voice the way everyone in the palace seemed to do whenever the king was mentioned. "There's always someone near his chambers," she said. "The king doesn't trust easily. Not since." She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. "Since what?" Cale asked. "It's not my place to say." Elowyn busied herself with the bread she was kneading, refusing to meet his eyes. "Best not to ask too many questions here, if you want my advice. Just do your work and keep your head down." It was advice Cale had already heard a dozen times since arriving, and yet each time he heard it, his curiosity only grew sharper. There was a story here, something the entire palace seemed to know, and no one dared speak aloud. A king who never slept in his own bed. An Omega bought, and then abandoned to solitude. A guard who stood outside a door that led to an empty room. That night, Cale prepared the chamber as he always did, but this time, instead of sitting on the bed and waiting, he found himself standing near the door, listening for the sound of footsteps in the hallway. When he heard them arrive, quiet and deliberate, he did not step back this time. He stayed close to the wood, his hand resting lightly against its surface, as though he might feel something through the grain of the door itself. He did not know why it mattered so much to him. Perhaps it was simply that after 9 days of being utterly alone in a palace full of strangers, the mere presence of someone on the other side of that door, close enough to hear him breathe, felt like the first real connection he had made since arriving. Even if that someone had no idea he was standing there, even if that someone was only a guard doing his duty. He did not yet understand that the man standing outside his door every single night was not a guard at all. He did not yet understand that it was the king himself. Cale pressed his palm flat against the wood and closed his eyes, and on the other side of that door, close enough to touch if not for the barrier between them, King Draven stood in the darkness of the corridor, his own hand raised as though he might knock, and did not. He had stood there every night since Cale arrived. He would stand there every night for a long while yet, and Cale, warming an empty bed each evening, had no idea that the king he thought had forgotten him had never once left his side. The 10th night passed, the same as the others, and the 11th after that. Cale grew almost used to the strange rhythm of his new life, the preparing of the room, the long hours of waiting, the small comfort of footsteps outside his door that he had begun, without quite admitting it to himself, to listen for. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself a guard was simply a guard, and that his growing habit of pressing his hand to the door each night before he slept was nothing more than loneliness playing tricks on a frightened young man far from home. But some part of him, quiet and stubborn, had already begun to wonder about the man he had never met, the king who filled every conversation in the palace with fear, and yet could not bring himself to enter his own bedchamber. And though Cale did not know it yet, that quiet wondering was the first thread of something that would, in time, change both of their lives completely. The palace kitchens buzzed with morning noise, as Cale carried a tray of empty dishes back from the king's chamber, though of course nothing on that tray had actually been eaten. He had begun this small ritual himself, without anyone telling him to do it, carrying food up each evening and back down each morning, as though the appearance of use might convince the rest of the staff that his position mattered, that he mattered, even if the truth was far lonelier. Mira caught him in the corridor outside the dining hall, her sharp eyes flicking over the untouched bread on his tray. "Still nothing," she said. It was not a question. "Still nothing," Cale confirmed. She studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened just slightly, the way it sometimes did when she thought no one else was watching. "Come with me," she said. "Walk with me a moment." Cale set the tray down with one of the kitchen boys and followed her out into the palace gardens, where the morning air was cool and smelled of rosemary and turned earth. Mira did not speak until they were well away from the servants hurrying between buildings. "You want to know why he doesn't come?" she said finally. Cale's heart quickened. "I didn't ask." "You didn't need to. It's written all over your face every morning." Mira paused beside a stone bench and gestured for him to sit, though she remained standing herself, arms folded over her chest. "I'll tell you what I know, but understand that I am breaking a rule by telling you any of it, and if you repeat it to anyone in this palace, I will deny every word." Kale nodded quickly, eager and afraid all at once. 3 years ago, Mira began, before you were born into this position, the king took an Omega to his bed properly. His name was Fenwick. Charming. Beautiful. Everyone in the palace adored him, the king most of all. For nearly a year, Fenwick shared the king's chamber every night, and for the first time since his wives passed, the king seemed almost happy. "What happened to him?" Kale asked, though he already suspected the answer would not be a pleasant one. Mira's jaw tightened. Fenwick was working for someone else, an enemy of the crown, from a neighboring kingdom that wanted Ashvale weakened. He put something in the king's wine one night, slow poison, meant to look like illness, meant to kill him over months rather than all at once, so no one would suspect foul play. She paused, watching a bird land on the garden wall before continuing. The king's physician caught it just in time. Fenwick was executed for treason. The king nearly died from what had already been done to him, and it took the better part of a year for him to fully recover his strength. Kale sat in stunned silence, the pieces slowly beginning to fit together in his mind. So he doesn't trust anyone in his bed anymore. He doesn't trust anyone, full stop, Mira said. Not Omegas, not advisors, barely his own generals, and they've served him for 20 years. But Omegas most of all, because that was the wound that nearly killed him, and it was delivered by someone he had let closer than anyone else in his life. Then why did he buy me at all? Kale's voice came out smaller than he intended. Why go through the trouble of having a bed Omega, if he never intends to use one? Mira's expression turned almost gentle, an expression so unfamiliar on her sharp features that Kale barely recognized it. Tradition demands it. The court expects the king to have an Omega in residence, a symbol of stability, of a household properly maintained. Whether he ever sets foot in that room is another matter entirely, and one I suspect even he hasn't fully worked out for himself. Kale turned the information over in his mind for the rest of the day, carrying it with him through his chores like a stone in his pocket. It explained so much: the empty bed, the untouched wine, the guard stationed outside a room the king never entered. It even explained, he thought, the flicker of something like sympathy he sometimes caught in the eyes of the older servants when they looked at him. But it did not explain everything. It did not explain why, if the king never intended to visit his chamber, someone had begun leaving small kindnesses in Kale's path that he could not trace to any obvious source. It had started 3 days earlier, though Kale had been too startled to make much of it at the time. He had woken to find a woolen blanket, far softer and finer than anything the Omega quarters usually provided, folded neatly at the foot of the great bed. He assumed one of the maids had left it, though when he asked Elowyn about it later, she had simply shrugged and said she knew nothing. The following evening, a small dish of honeyed almonds had appeared on the table beside the wine, a treat Kale had mentioned only once, in passing, to no one in particular except the empty room itself, wondering aloud if the kitchens ever made such things. He had thought it was simply coincidence. Then, 2 nights after that, he had fallen ill with a fever that left him shivering under the furs long after midnight, and by morning, a small vial of medicine had appeared on the bedside table, along with a folded cloth, soaked in something that smelled faintly of mint, and eased the ache in his head the moment he pressed it to his forehead. He never saw who brought it, he never heard the door open, and yet there it was, exactly when he needed it, as though someone had been listening closely enough to know precisely what he required, and precisely when he required it. He began to test the theory, carefully, the way one tests ice on a frozen pond. He mentioned, quietly and only once, that his shoes had begun to pinch his feet after long days of standing. 2 days later, a new pair sat waiting for him, soft leather, perfectly his size. He mentioned that the candles in his chamber burned too quickly and left the room dark before dawn, and the very next night, thicker, longer-burning candles replaced the old ones without a word of explanation from anyone. Someone was watching him. Someone was listening to him, closely enough to notice the smallest details of his days, and yet that same someone never once showed their face, never left a note, never gave any indication of who they were or why they cared. Kale began to wonder if it might be the guard who stood outside his door each night. It seemed impossible. Guards were meant to protect, not to fuss over an Omega's comfort with quiet, careful gifts. and yet the timing lined up too neatly to ignore. The blanket had appeared the morning after he had shivered audibly enough that surely someone standing just outside the door might have heard it. The almonds had appeared after a night when he had spoken his small wish aloud, alone in the room, believing no one could hear him at all. He began speaking more, after that, not loudly, not obviously, but in small, quiet observations, made to the empty air of his chamber each night before he slept. He spoke of his sister, whom he missed terribly. He spoke of the songs his mother used to hum while she baked. He spoke of his fear that he had been forgotten by his own family, sold away, and never thought of again. He told himself he was simply talking to keep himself company in the silence. He told himself it did not matter whether anyone was listening at all. But some nights, when he pressed his ear to the door before falling asleep, he was almost certain he could hear the faint, steady breathing of someone standing very still on the other side, listening to every word. He did not yet dare to open the door and look. 3 weeks into his new life at the palace, Kale had grown bold enough to explore corridors he had once been too afraid to wander. He told himself it was simple curiosity, the natural response of a young man trying to make sense of a strange new world, but in truth, part of him was searching. He wanted to catch a glimpse of the king, the elusive figure whose name filled every room with hushed reverence and fear, the man who had never once entered his own bedchamber and yet seemed to know Kale's every small want, before Kale had fully admitted it to himself. He found his chance on a gray, rain-soaked afternoon, when Mira sent him to deliver a message to the royal study on the far side of the palace. He had never been to that wing before, and he walked slowly, taking in the tall windows and the portraits of past kings that lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow him as he passed. The study door was open when he arrived, and inside, seated at a great oak desk covered in maps and papers, was a man Kale recognized instantly, though he had never once seen his face. King Draven was younger than Kale had expected, though his eyes carried a weariness that made him seem far older than his years. He was broad-shouldered, dressed simply for a king, in a dark tunic without the ornate trappings Kale had imagined a ruler would wear. A thin scar ran along his jaw, pale and old, and his hands, resting on the desk before him, were calloused, in a way that suggested he had spent as much time with a sword as with matters of state. Kale froze in the doorway, message forgotten in his hand, and for one long, unbearable moment, neither of them spoke. It was Draven who broke the silence first, his voice low and rough, as though it had gone unused for too long. "You're the new one," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, Your Majesty." Kale managed a stiff, awkward bow, nearly dropping the sealed letter in the process. "I have a message from Mira, about the household accounts." Draven held out his hand without rising, and Kale crossed the room to place the letter in it, careful not to let their fingers touch. Up close, the king's eyes were a deep, storm-gray color, and they studied Kale with an intensity that made his skin prickle, though there was nothing cruel in the look. If anything, Kale thought, there was something almost sorrowful in it, some old grief the king carried behind his composed expression. "What is your name?" Draven asked, setting the unopened letter aside. "Kale, Your Majesty." "Kale," the king repeated it slowly, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth. "Are they treating you well in the Omega quarters?" The question caught Kale off guard. He had expected indifference from the king, or perhaps cold formality, but not this quiet, careful attention. "Yes, Your Majesty. Everyone has been kind." Draven's gaze flickered downward for just a moment, to Kale's hands, which he realized too late were trembling slightly at his sides. "You needn't be afraid of me," the king said, though his tone made it clear he understood exactly why Kale was. "I'm not afraid," Kale lied. Something that might almost have been a smile touched the corner of Draven's mouth, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You may go," he said, turning his attention back to the papers on his desk, and Kale understood the audience had ended. He left the study with his heart pounding, replaying every word of the brief exchange over and over as he walked back through the corridors. The king had asked after his well-being. The king had noticed his trembling hands and chosen not to comment on it cruelly. There had been nothing in his manner that matched the stories Kale had heard whispered throughout the palace, the tales of a ruthless ruler who crushed rebellions without mercy and buried wives without tears. That evening, as Kale prepared the king's chamber the way he did every night, he found himself moving with unusual care, straightening the furs just a little more precisely, arranging the candles just a little more thoughtfully, as though the king might actually walk through the door for the first time since Cale's arrival. He did not come, of course. He never did. But as Cale lay awake in the enormous bed, staring up at the painted stars on the ceiling, he found his thoughts returning again and again to the storm-gray eyes that had studied him so carefully in the study that afternoon, and to the strange, quiet sorrow he had glimpsed behind them. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it finally did, Cale dreamed of a wolf standing guard outside a locked door, patient and unmoving, waiting for something it did not believe it deserved to have. He woke near midnight to the sound of voices in the corridor outside his chamber, low and urgent, though he could not make out the words. He recognized one voice as belonging to a guard captain named Corin, a stern, gray-haired man who commanded the palace watch. The second voice was quieter, more controlled, but unmistakably the same voice that had spoken to him in the study that afternoon. Curiosity overpowered caution. Cale slipped from the bed and crept to the door, pressing his ear against the wood the way he had grown accustomed to doing each night. "You cannot keep doing this, Your Majesty," Corin was saying, his voice tight with something that sounded almost like worry. "Standing guard outside your own chamber like a common soldier. It isn't fitting for a king, and it isn't safe. Let one of my men take the post." "I trust my own men to guard the outer walls," came Draven's reply, calm but final. "This door, I guard myself." "For 3 years now," Corin pressed. "Every single night. You barely sleep as it is, and now you stand in a cold hallway until dawn, instead of resting in your own bed. The physicians worry for your health, Draven, whether you'll hear it from them or not." There was a long pause before the king spoke again, and when he did, his voice had dropped so low that Cale had to strain to catch the words at all. "I cannot lie beside another Omega, Corin. Not after Fenwick. I thought I could manage it, buying another, keeping tradition, but I find I cannot even open the door." Another pause, heavier than the first. "So I stand here instead. It is enough that he is safe. It is enough that I know it." Cale's breath caught in his throat, and he pressed his palm flat against the door, as though he might somehow reach through the wood and touch the man standing so close on the other side. "He is safe," the king had said. "Not comfortable, not content, safe." As though Cale's safety were the only thing the king had allowed himself to want from this entire arrangement, the only piece of it he trusted himself to hold on to. Corin said something further, too quiet for Cale to catch, and then the sound of the guard captain's footsteps retreated down the corridor, leaving only silence behind. Cale remained at the door for a long while after that, listening to nothing but his own heartbeat and the faint, steady breathing he now knew belonged to the king himself, standing watch outside a room he could not bring himself to enter, guarding an Omega he had bought but never once claimed. When Cale finally returned to the bed, he lay awake until the first gray light of dawn crept through the curtains, his mind turning over everything he had just learned. The rumors had been true then. Not the cruel ones about a heartless tyrant, but the sadder ones, the ones the servants only ever half finished before catching themselves. A king, broken by betrayal, standing guard each night over the very thing he was too wounded to accept. Cale did not know, yet, what he intended to do with this knowledge. But something in his chest had shifted overnight. Some quiet ember of sympathy kindled where fear and confusion had lived before, and he suspected that whatever came next between himself and the king who guarded his door, it would not be the story either of them had expected to write. The days that followed the overheard conversation passed differently for Cale. He carried the king's words with him everywhere, turning them over in his mind while he folded linens, while he walked the garden paths, while he sat each evening in the enormous empty bed that no longer felt quite so lonely, now that he understood the reason behind its emptiness. He began to notice things he had missed before, small details that now made perfect sense in light of what he had overheard. The way the guards near the royal wing always seemed to know exactly when Cale passed by, as though someone had instructed them to watch for him, without ever explaining why. The way fresh flowers appeared in his chamber every few days, always the same variety his mother used to grow in their garden back home, though he had never once mentioned that particular flower to anyone in the palace at all. The way the fireplace in his room was always lit before he arrived each evening, warm and crackling, though he never saw a single servant come to tend it. Someone had been paying very close attention to him indeed, and now Cale understood exactly who. He wanted to speak of it, but he did not know how. To confront the king directly would mean admitting he had eavesdropped on a private conversation not meant for his ears, and Kale feared what consequences might follow such an admission. So instead, he began leaving small offerings of his own, quiet gestures meant for a man who might never even see them, but who Kale suspected would understand exactly what they meant. He began leaving a second cup of tea beside his own each evening, poured but untouched, set carefully near the door, as though waiting for someone who might, one night, finally decide to come inside and drink it. He began speaking a little louder when he spoke to the empty room at night, no longer simply murmuring half-thoughts to himself, but sharing whole stories, whole memories, as though narrating his day to a companion who could not answer back, but who he now believed was listening all the same. He told the empty room about his sister's laugh and how she used to steal biscuits from the kitchen and blame the family dog. He told it about the winter his family's roof had partially collapsed under heavy snow, and how his father had spent 3 days repairing it in the bitter cold rather than let his children sleep beneath an open sky. He told it, one evening, about the fear he had carried into this palace, the certainty that he would be hurt or discarded, and how that fear had slowly, strangely, begun to fade. "I don't know who you are," he said quietly to the door one night, his heart pounding at his own boldness, "but thank you. For the blanket, for the almonds, for the flowers that remind me of home." He paused, gathering his courage. "I know you're there most nights. I can hear you. I just wanted you to know that I know, and that I'm not afraid." There was no response. There never was. But Kale thought, or perhaps only hoped, that the silence on the other side of the door had grown just slightly less guarded, just slightly softer, as though the man standing there had let out a breath he had been holding for a very long time. His growing courage did not go unnoticed by the rest of the palace. Mira, sharp as ever, caught the change in him within days. "You're different," she observed one morning, watching him hum quietly to himself as he arranged fresh linens. "What's happened?" "Nothing," Kale said, though the small smile he could not quite hide told a different story. Mira's eyes narrowed thoughtfully, but she did not press further, and Kale was grateful for it. He was not ready to explain the strange, fragile thing growing quietly inside him, this cautious warmth toward a man he had spoken to only once, face to face, and who he now understood far better through silence and small kindnesses than most people came to know each other through years of conversation. It was Elowen, the cheerful kitchen maid, who eventually voiced what half the palace staff had apparently begun to whisper among themselves. She cornered Kale in the pantry one afternoon, her eyes bright with barely contained curiosity. "They're saying the king has been different lately too," she said, keeping her voice low despite the empty room around them. "Quieter at council meetings, less quick to anger. One of the stable boys says he even smiled last week, if you can believe it, right there in front of General Corrin, who nearly fell off his own horse from the shock of it." Kale felt heat rise to his cheeks. "I have nothing to do with that." "No one said you did." Elowen's grin widened knowingly. "I only thought you'd want to know." Kale busied himself with sorting the dried herbs in front of him, unwilling to let Elowen see just how much her words had affected him. A king smiling, a king less quick to anger. It seemed such a small thing, and yet Kale could not help the small, hopeful flutter that rose in his chest at the thought that perhaps, in some quiet way he barely understood, he was reaching a man everyone else in this palace had long since given up trying to reach at all. That night, preparing the chamber as he always did, Kale found himself lingering longer than usual over each small task, as though delaying the moment he would have to settle into the bed and begin his solitary wait. He arranged the candles with particular care. He set out not 1 cup of tea but 2, exactly as he had begun doing each evening, and beside the second cup, on impulse, he placed a single flower from the small bouquet that had appeared in his room that morning, the same variety his mother used to grow. He did not know if the gesture would be noticed. He did not know if it would mean anything at all to the man standing guard outside his door each night, carrying grief too heavy to set down even for a moment's rest in his own bed. But as Kale finally climbed beneath the firs and closed his eyes, listening to the familiar, steady sound of breathing just beyond the wooden door, he allowed himself, for the first time since arriving at this palace, to hope that something might be changing between them. Slowly, quietly, one small kindness at a time. The autumn winds arrived early that year, sweeping through the palace gardens and stripping the last color from the trees within a matter of days. Cale had now lived within the walls of Ashvale for nearly 2 months, and though the ache of missing his family had never fully left him, it had settled into something quieter, something he could carry without it crushing him entirely. He had grown close, in that time, to a young guard named Bram, who was often posted near the Omega quarters, and who had a habit of sneaking Cale small treats from the kitchens when Mira wasn't looking. Bram was easy company, cheerful and talkative in a way that helped fill the quiet hours, and he seemed to know a great deal about the inner workings of palace life that the other staff were reluctant to share. It was Bram who first mentioned the old nurse. "Tilly," he said one afternoon, as the two of them sat on a low garden wall, watching the last leaves fall from an ancient oak tree. She raised the king herself, back when he was just a boy, before his father passed, and left him the crown too young. If anyone in this palace knows the real truth about him, it's her. She still lives in the East Wing, though she doesn't leave her rooms much these days. Cale's curiosity, never far from the surface where the king was concerned, sparked immediately. "Do you think she would speak with me?" Bram shrugged, tossing a fallen leaf into the wind. "Can't say. She's particular about who she lets in. But you could try. Tell her Bram sent you, if it helps. She's fond of me, for reasons I've never quite understood." It took Cale 3 days to gather the courage to seek out the old nurse's chambers, tucked away in a quiet corner of the East Wing, where the corridors grew narrow, and the portraits on the walls grew older and more faded. He knocked softly on the door, and after a long pause, it opened to reveal a small, stooped woman, with kind eyes and hair as white as new snow. "You're the new Bed Omega," Tilly said, studying him with a sharpness that belied her frail appearance. "Bram's mentioned you. Come in then, before the draft chills these old bones any further." Her chambers were warm and cluttered, filled with the accumulated treasures of a long life spent in service to the crown. Cale sat where she directed, on a worn but comfortable chair beside the fire, while Tilly settled into her own seat, with the careful movements of someone whose joints had long since stopped forgiving her for the years she had spent standing at a young prince's side. "I imagine you have questions," Tilly said, not unkindly. "Everyone who comes to me does." "I want to understand him," Cale admitted. "The king. I've heard pieces of his story, but I don't understand how a boy grows into a man so guarded he can't sleep in his own bed." Tilly was quiet for a long moment, her eyes drifting toward the fire, as though searching for the right place to begin. "Draven wasn't always like this," she said finally. "As a boy, he was gentle, curious. He used to follow me through the gardens asking 100 questions a day about everything under the sun. His father was a hard man, cold in the way kings often are, and Draven spent most of his childhood trying to earn a warmth from him that never came." She paused, folding her weathered hands in her lap. "When his father died, Draven was barely 20, thrust onto the throne before he was ready, surrounded by advisors who saw a young king as an opportunity, rather than a boy who needed guidance. He learned quickly to trust no one but himself. It hardened him, but it didn't destroy him. Not yet." "And then Fenwick," Cale said quietly. Audley's expression darkened. "Fenwick very nearly did destroy him. Draven had let himself love again, for the first time since losing both his wives to illness, within a single terrible year. He thought he'd finally found something real, something worth trusting. And it was a lie, built specifically to end his life." She shook her head slowly. "I nursed him back to health myself, those long months after the poison. I have never seen a man's spirit break the way his did, even as his body slowly recovered. He stopped speaking of love entirely after that. Stopped speaking of trust. He built walls so high I feared no one would ever reach him again." Cale's chest ached at the image the old nurse painted, so different from the fearsome tyrant the rest of the kingdom whispered about. "But he bought another Omega," Cale said. "He bought me." "Tradition demanded an Omega in residence," Tilly said, echoing what Mira had told him weeks earlier. "But I don't think that's the whole truth, child. I've known that boy his entire life, and I've watched him these past 2 months, more closely than you might imagine. Something in him softened the day you arrived in this palace. I don't think even he understands why. He's never even spoken to me," Cale said. Though even as the words left his mouth, he thought of the study, of storm-gray eyes studying him with quiet sorrow, of a voice through a door telling a guard captain, "It is enough that he is safe." Not really. Not more than a handful of words. Ottilie smiled, a small, knowing thing that reminded Cale suddenly of his own grandmother. "Some conversations don't need words, child. He stands outside your door every night, does he not? He notices what you need before you ask for it, does he not? That is not nothing. That is a man who has forgotten how to say the things he feels, choosing instead to show them, quietly, in the only language he still trusts himself to speak." Cale sat with that thought long after he left the old nurse's chambers, carrying it with him through the darkening corridors back toward his own wing. He thought of the tea he left out each night, the words he spoke to an empty room that was never truly empty at all, the small flower he had left beside a second cup, as though extending an invitation he did not yet have the courage to speak aloud. That evening, as he prepared the king's chamber, Cale made a decision. He would not wait any longer for words that might never come easily to a man so wounded by his past. Instead, he took a small piece of parchment from the writing desk near the window, and by candlelight, he wrote a short, simple note. "I know you are there each night. I am not afraid of you. I would like, very much, to know you as more than a voice through a door, whenever you are ready. There is no hurry. Cale." He folded the note carefully, and, with trembling hands, slid it beneath the heavy wooden door, out into the corridor, where he knew, without needing to check, that the king would find it within the hour. Then he climbed into the enormous bed, pulled the furs up to his chin, and waited, his heart pounding louder than it had any night since his arrival, to see what, if anything, might finally change. Cale did not sleep that night. He lay in the darkness listening for any sound from beyond the door, straining to hear whether the note he had slipped beneath it had been noticed, whether it had been picked up at all, or whether it still lay untouched on the cold stone floor of the corridor. The steady breathing he had grown so used to hearing seemed different tonight, less even, as though its owner had gone still and quiet, in a way that suggested surprise rather than routine. An hour passed, then two. Cale began to fear he had made a terrible mistake, that he had pushed too hard, too fast, against walls the old nurse herself had described as impossibly high. Perhaps the king had simply left the note where it lay, and retreated, unwilling or unable to answer such an open invitation. But near the third hour of the night, Cale heard something he had never once heard in all his weeks at the palace. The soft, deliberate sound of the door handle turning. He sat up immediately, his heart hammering so loudly, he was certain it could be heard through the walls themselves. The door opened only partway, slowly, cautiously, as though the man on the other side half expected to be turned away even now. Candlelight from the corridor spilled into the dark chamber, and there, framed in the doorway, stood King Draven, still fully dressed, as though he had never intended to sleep at all, the small folded note held carefully in one hand. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Cale remained sitting upright in the enormous bed, and Draven remained standing at the threshold, neither entering nor retreating, caught somewhere between the two like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, uncertain whether the ground ahead would hold his weight. "You wrote this," Draven said finally, his voice rough with something that might have been disbelief. "I did," Cale answered softly. "You know that I stand outside this door each night. I've known for some time now." Cale pushed the furs back and rose from the bed, crossing the room slowly, giving the king every opportunity to step back if he wished to. He did not. "I don't mind it. I only thought, perhaps, it might be less lonely for both of us, if the door stayed open sometimes. That's all." Draven's storm-gray eyes searched his face for a long moment, looking for something Cale couldn't quite name, some sign of deception or hidden motive, the way Ottilie had described him searching everyone's face since Fenwick's betrayal. Whatever he was looking for, he did not seem to find it, and slowly, cautiously, some of the tension eased from his broad shoulders. "I don't know how to do this," Draven admitted, and the honesty in his voice struck Cale harder than any grand declaration could have. "I bought you because tradition demanded it, and I told myself I would never ask anything more of you than your presence in this room. I did not expect." He stopped, seeming to search for the right words. "I did not expect to find myself thinking of you as I have." "You don't have to know how to do this," Cale said gently. "We can learn together. There's no need to rush toward anything neither of us is ready for." Draven studied him a moment longer, before finally, hesitantly, stepping fully into the room. He did not approach the bed. Instead, he crossed to the small table near the window, where the second cup of tea Cale had left out, now long cold, still sat beside its wilting flower. "You left this for me," Draven said, understanding dawning slowly across his features. "Every night?" "Every night," Cale confirmed. "I didn't know if you'd ever drink it. I only wanted you to know it was there, if you ever wanted it." Something shifted in the king's expression then, some old, guarded thing cracking just slightly at the edges. He picked up the cold cup and, without a word, drank from it anyway, as though the gesture mattered more than the temperature of the tea itself. They talked for a while after that, standing on opposite sides of the room at first, though the distance between them seemed to shrink with every passing minute. Draven spoke haltingly, unused to sharing anything of himself, but Cale was patient, asking gentle questions and offering quiet stories of his own in return, and slowly, the king began to speak more freely than Cale suspected he had in years. He spoke of his boyhood, echoing pieces of what Ottilie had already shared, though hearing it from Draven's own voice carried a different weight entirely. He spoke, briefly and with visible difficulty, of Fenwick, though he did not linger long on that particular wound. And he spoke, toward the end of the night, of the strange comfort he had found simply listening to Cale speak, each evening through the wooden door, the small stories of home and family that had, without Draven quite realizing it, become the most peaceful part of his days. "I thought I was intruding on your privacy," Draven admitted. "Listening the way I did, I should have announced myself. I simply couldn't bring myself to open the door." "I'm glad you listened," Cale said honestly. "I think I was speaking as much for myself as for you. It helped, knowing someone was there, even if I didn't yet understand who." They did not speak of anything beyond that night, made no promises, neither of them was ready to keep. But as the first gray light of dawn began creeping through the curtains, Draven lingered longer than Cale expected, reluctant, it seemed, to return to the cold corridor outside. "May I come again tomorrow?" he asked, and there was something almost boyish in the question, some echo of the gentle, curious child Ottilie had described, still buried somewhere beneath years of grief and guarded walls. "You may come whenever you wish," Cale said. "The door will always be open to you, even on the nights you're not ready to walk through it." Draven's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile, but was, Cale thought, the closest thing to one he had likely allowed himself in a very long time. He left before the sun fully rose, slipping back into the corridor and, Cale suspected, back into his familiar post outside the door, though something in the quality of the silence that followed felt different now. Less like a wall standing guard, and more like a man simply choosing, one careful step at a time, to stay close to something he was slowly learning he did not have to fear. In the weeks that followed, the Palace of Ashvale began to notice a change so remarkable that even the most seasoned staff struggled to explain it. The king, who had once locked himself away behind grief and suspicion, now smiled, on occasion, during council meetings. He asked after the well-being of his household staff by name, something he had not done in years. General Corrin, who had known Draven since he was a boy learning to hold a sword too heavy for his young arms, remarked to anyone who would listen that he had not seen the king look so unburdened since before his father's death. None of them knew the reason lay in the quiet hours after midnight, when Draven slipped into a chamber he had once refused to enter, and sat with an Omega who asked nothing of him beyond honest conversation. Their meetings did not happen every night, not at first. Draven still carried the weight of his old wounds, and there were evenings when Cale heard only the familiar sound of breathing outside the door, no handle turning, no candlelight spilling into the dark room. Cale never pushed on those nights. He simply left the second cup of tea as he always did, spoke his quiet stories to the wood between them, and let Draven come to him in his own time, at his own pace. But when the king did come, their conversations grew longer, easier, filled with a warmth that surprised them both. Draven began to ask questions of his own, curious about Cale's life before the palace, about his family, his childhood, the small dreams he had once held before circumstance had swept them away. "What did you want to be?" Draven asked one evening, seated now on the edge of the great bed, rather than lingering near the door, before all of this. Cale considered the question carefully, surprised by how long it had been since anyone had asked it of him. "A healer, I think," My grandmother knew a great deal about herbs and medicine, and she used to let me help her treat the villagers when I was young. I liked the feeling of it, making something better instead of watching it fall apart. Something flickered across Draven's face, and Cale recognized it, after their weeks of careful conversation, as the particular sorrow that surfaced whenever the king thought of things lost or left unfinished. "You would have made a fine healer," Draven said quietly. "I'm sorry that path was taken from you." "I don't know that it was taken entirely," Cale said, surprising himself with the lightness in his own voice. "Perhaps I simply found a different kind of healing to do instead." Draven's storm-gray eyes met his, and for a long moment, neither of them looked away. It was Bram, oddly enough, who first noticed the shift most clearly among the household staff, catching Cale humming softly to himself one morning as he crossed the garden path toward the kitchens. "You look happy," Bram observed, falling into step beside him. "Properly happy. Not just pretending for Mira's sake." "I am happy," Cale admitted, and found he meant it entirely. Word of the change reached Ottilia as well, and on one of Cale's regular visits to her chambers, the old nurse studied him with open delight. Her weathered face creased into a wide smile. "I told you, didn't I?" she said, pouring them both cups of tea with hands that trembled only slightly from age. "That boy has always spoken more clearly through actions than words. It seems you've learned to listen." Not everyone in the palace received the change so warmly. Cale noticed, in the weeks that followed, a certain coldness from a few of the older courtiers, men and women who had served the crown long enough to remember Fenwick's betrayal firsthand, and who eyed Cale now with open suspicion whenever he passed through the grand halls. He overheard, more than once, whispered concerns about history repeating itself, about an Omega worming his way into the king's trust, only to strike when the moment was right. The words stung more than Cale expected, though he understood the fear behind them. He said nothing of it to Draven at first, unwilling to burden their fragile, growing closeness with old suspicions that were not truly his to carry. But Draven, it seemed, had ears throughout his own palace, and he raised the matter himself one evening, his jaw tight with quiet anger. "I've heard what some of the court says about you," he said. "About us." Cale's stomach tightened. "It doesn't matter what they say. It matters to me." Draven's voice was firm, though gentler than Cale had ever heard directed at anyone discussing palace politics. "I will not have you treated with suspicion for crimes you did not commit. Fenwick's betrayal was his own, and I have spent 3 years punishing myself for trusting him. I will not punish you for the same mistake. You don't owe me protection from gossip," Cale said softly, though the warmth spreading through his chest told a different story entirely. "I owe you far more than that," Draven replied, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice made Cale's breath catch. "You have given me back pieces of myself I thought Fenwick had taken forever. The least I can offer in return is my trust, plainly and publicly, whatever the court chooses to whisper about it." True to his word, Draven began including Cale more visibly in the rhythms of palace life over the following days, small gestures that spoke louder than any formal announcement could have. He requested Cale's presence at a modest garden gathering with a handful of trusted advisors. He asked, once, for Cale's opinion on a matter of household management, and listened with genuine attention to the answer. He made no grand declarations, no sweeping proclamations to the court, but the message traveled through the palace regardless, carried on the same whispers that had once spread doubt. The king trusted this Omega, and slowly, cautiously, so too did the palace around him. It was during one of these small gatherings, on a mild evening in the garden, as the last of the season's roses clung stubbornly to their vines, that Draven reached out and took Cale's hand for the first time, right there, in front of the small circle of advisors gathered around them. It was a simple gesture, brief and unremarkable to anyone watching, but Cale felt the weight of it settle deep in his chest, a quiet, unspoken promise passing between them in the warmth of that single touch. Neither of them spoke of what it meant. Neither of them needed to. Some things, Cale had learned these past weeks, spoke far more clearly in silence than they ever could in words. The warmth that had settled over the palace in recent weeks did not sit well with everyone, and the first sign of trouble arrived quietly, the way most dangerous things did. Cale noticed it first in a courtier named Talia, a cousin of one of the king's former advisors, who had watched his rising closeness with Draven, with an expression that never quite reached warmth, no matter how pleasant her words were. "You've done well for yourself," Talia said one afternoon, catching Chaol alone in the palace library, where he had taken to spending his quiet hours reading whatever texts on herbs and healing he could find among the king's collection. Her smile did not reach her eyes. An omega from nothing, rising so quickly in the king's favor. Some might call it fortunate, others might call it familiar. Chaol understood the implication immediately, the echo of Fenwick's name hanging unspoken in the air between them. "I've done nothing but be honest with him," Chaol said evenly, refusing to let her see how the comparison stung. "So did the last one, for a time." Talia's smile sharpened just slightly, before she swept from the room, leaving Chaol alone with a chill that had nothing to do with the library's cool stone walls. He did not mention the encounter to Draven at first. Unwilling to add fuel to a fire he hoped might simply burn itself out. But the whispers did not fade. If anything, they grew louder in the days that followed, and Chaol began to notice a pattern to them. Small comments dropped at careful intervals, always from courtiers connected in some way to the old political faction that had once supported the treaty with the neighboring kingdom Fenwick had served. It was General Corin who finally brought the matter to a head, arriving at Chaol's chamber late one evening, with a grim expression that immediately set Chaol on edge. "There's been word from one of our informants in the Northern Territories," Corin said without preamble, glancing toward the door, as though to be certain they would not be overheard. "Whispers of a plot to discredit you, to convince the king that history is repeating itself. Someone wants him isolated again, the way he was after Fenwick. A king, without trust in anyone, is a king easier to manipulate." Chaol's blood ran cold. Who would benefit from that? "The same faction that benefited from Fenwick's betrayal in the first place," Corin said grimly. "They lost influence when the treaty collapsed after his execution. If they can convince the king that no Omega can be trusted, that his own judgment is fatally flawed when it comes to matters of the heart, they gain leverage over every decision he makes going forward, from trade agreements to matters of succession. Does Draven know? Not yet. I wanted to warn you first, in case they come at you directly before they come at him." Corin's stern face softened just slightly. "For what it's worth, I don't believe the rumors, whatever their source. I've watched you these past weeks. Whatever the king has found in you, it isn't manipulation." Chaol thanked the general, though the warning sat heavy in his chest for the rest of the night. When Draven arrived, later than usual, Chaol could see immediately that something weighed on him as well, a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there in recent weeks. "You've heard the whispers too," Chaol said quietly, before Draven could speak. The king's jaw tightened. "Corin came to me not an hour ago." He crossed the room slowly, sitting heavily on the edge of the bed, his broad shoulders bowed in a way that reminded Chaol, painfully, of the guarded stranger who had first stood outside this door refusing to enter. "I told myself I would not let old fears control me again, and yet here I am, listening to whispers, and feeling that same cold doubt creeping back in, despite everything." "Do you doubt me?" Chaol asked, and though his voice remained steady, his heart pounded as he waited for the answer. Draven was quiet for a long moment, staring at his own hands, as though searching for the truth written somewhere in the calluses and old scars. "No," he said finally, and the certainty in his voice, when it came, was absolute. "I do not doubt you. I doubt myself. I doubt my own judgment, because it failed me so completely once before, and some small, frightened part of me wonders if it could fail me again, without my even realizing it. That fear will always be there, I think," Chaol said gently, moving to sit beside him. "What happened to you left a wound that won't simply vanish because time has passed. But you don't have to let that fear decide everything for you. You get to choose, each day, whether to let old wounds speak louder than what's actually standing in front of you." Draven turned to look at him then, and something in his storm-gray eyes had softened, some of the tension easing from the set of his jaw. "And what is actually standing in front of me? Someone who has no interest in poison, or politics, or any of the games your court seems so fond of playing," Chaol said simply. "Someone who only wants to see you sleep peacefully in your own bed one day, without needing to guard the door at all." Draven's hand found his in the dim candlelight, fingers lacing together with a firmness that spoke more clearly than any promise could have. "I want that too," he admitted. More than I have wanted anything in a very long time. Whatever plot Talia and her faction were weaving in the shadows of the court, Kale understood in that moment that it would take far more than whispered rumors to unravel what had been carefully, patiently built between them these past weeks. But he also understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in his chest, that whispers alone were rarely the full extent of such schemes. If someone truly wanted to see history repeat itself, wanted to see the king isolated and vulnerable once more, they would not stop at mere gossip. He would need to be careful, for both their sakes. The proof of Kale's suspicions arrived a week later, in the form of a small, carefully folded letter, tucked among the linens, delivered to his chamber one morning. He noticed it only because the handwriting on the outside did not match any of the palace staff he had come to recognize, and something in the careful, deliberate script made the hair on his arms rise before he had even broken the seal. Inside, the message was brief and unsigned. It offered Kale a considerable sum of gold in exchange for a single task, slipping a particular powder into the king's evening wine, described only as something that would cause a brief illness, nothing lasting, nothing that would raise suspicion of true poison. The letter assured him that no one would ever trace it back to him, that the king's own physicians would simply record it as a passing fever, and that Kale would be free to leave the palace afterward, wealthy and unburdened by his current position, should he choose to disappear entirely. Kale's hands shook as he read it a second time, understanding immediately what was truly being asked of him. It was not simply illness they wanted, it was proof, manufactured and false, that could later be twisted into evidence of exactly the betrayal the whispering courtiers had been suggesting all along. If Kale were ever caught with such a powder in his possession, or if the king fell ill in any way that could be traced back to Kale's hands, it would not matter that the illness itself was minor. The damage to trust, to the fragile thing Kale and Draven had spent weeks so carefully building, would be devastating and perhaps irreparable. He did not hesitate. He carried the letter directly to General Corin, who read it with a darkening expression, before summoning two of his most trusted guards to begin tracing its origin. "You did the right thing, bringing this to me immediately," Corin said, folding the letter carefully into a leather pouch for safekeeping. "Whoever sent this expected you to either accept the offer out of greed, or hide it out of fear of being blamed regardless. They didn't expect you to simply hand it over." "I have nothing to hide," Kale said firmly, "and nothing to gain from hurting him. They've misjudged me entirely." Corin's stern expression softened into something like respect. "Then let's make certain the king knows the truth of this, before anyone else has the chance to twist it into something ugly." They found Draven in his study, and Kale watched the color drain from the king's face as he read the letter Corin presented, his hands tightening around the parchment until his knuckles turned pale. "Who sent this?" Draven's voice was low, dangerous in a way Kale had not heard from him before. The voice, perhaps, of the fearsome ruler the rest of the kingdom whispered about. "We're tracing it now," Corin assured him. "But your majesty, I think it's important you understand that Kale brought this to me the moment he received it." He did not hesitate. He did not consider the offer, even briefly. Draven's stormy gaze lifted to meet Kale's, and for one terrible suspended moment, Kale feared he might see doubt there after all. Some final crack in the fragile trust they had built giving way beneath the weight of yet another betrayal, aimed at the very heart of it. But instead, what Kale saw in the king's eyes was something closer to fierce, protective anger, directed entirely outward, toward whoever had dared to try and use Kale this way. "Find them," Draven said to Corin, his voice steady now, controlled despite the anger simmering beneath it. "Whoever sent this letter will answer for it." It took only 3 more days for Corin's investigation to uncover the truth. The letter, it turned out, traced back through a series of careful intermediaries to Talia herself, working in concert with 2 other courtiers from the same faction that had once benefited from Fenwick's treachery. They had hoped, Corin explained, that either Kale's greed or his fear would hand them exactly the scandal they needed to drive a wedge between the king and the Omega who had begun, quite visibly, to soften his guarded heart. The 3 conspirators were brought before the king in a formal hearing, and though Kale was not required to attend, he chose to stand quietly at the back of the great hall regardless, watching as Draven addressed the matter with a calm, measured authority that left no doubt in anyone's mind about where his trust now firmly resided. "You believed," Draven said to the assembled court, his voice carrying easily through the vast chamber, that I could be manipulated, through old wounds, and manufactured suspicion, the same way I once was manipulated through genuine betrayal. You were wrong. I have learned, this past year, the difference between a man who seeks to harm me and one who seeks only honesty in return. I will not make the mistake of confusing the two again, no matter how carefully you try to blur the line between them. The conspirators were stripped of their titles and exiled from the capital, their influence over the northern faction broken entirely by the public unraveling of their scheme. And though the whispers did not vanish entirely from the palace halls, they grew markedly quieter, chastened perhaps, by the clear and public demonstration of exactly where the king's trust and loyalty now stood. That evening, when Draven came to Chaol's chamber, he did not linger near the door the way he sometimes still did on his more hesitant nights. He crossed the room directly, closing the distance between them, without a moment's pause, and gathered Chaol carefully into his arms. "They tried to take you from me," he murmured, "the same way Fenwick's shadow has haunted every choice I've made these past 3 years. And I found that I would rather face that fear head-on than lose what we've built here out of cowardice." "You didn't lose anything," Chaol said softly, resting his head against the king's chest, listening to the steady, sure beat of his heart. "You never will, if I have any say in it." "Then perhaps," Draven said, and Chaol could hear the faint, hesitant smile in his voice, even without seeing it. "It's time I stopped standing guard outside this door every night, and started simply sleeping in it instead." Winter arrived in full over the following weeks, blanketing the palace gardens in soft white snow, and drawing the court indoors to gather around great roaring fires in the evenings. For Chaol, the season felt different from any winter he had known before, warmer somehow despite the cold pressing against the windows, filled with a quiet, steady happiness he had not believed himself capable of finding when he first arrived at Ashvale so many months ago, frightened and alone. Draven kept his word. He no longer stood guard in the cold corridor each night, though old habits, Chaol had learned, did not vanish overnight entirely. There were still evenings when the king grew quiet and distant, old grief surfacing unexpectedly in the middle of a pleasant conversation, and on those nights, Chaol simply held his hand and waited, patient and unhurried, the way he had learned to be from the very beginning. Ottilie remarked, during one of Chaol's frequent visits to her chambers, that she had not seen the king look so at peace since he was a small boy following her through the summer gardens, asking 100 questions a day about a world that had not yet taught him to be afraid of it. "You gave him something back," the old nurse said, pouring their tea with steadier hands than Chaol remembered from their first meeting, as though even she seemed lighter these days. "Something Fenwick's betrayal nearly stole from him forever. I don't think he'll ever forget what that cost you both, but I think, perhaps, he's finally learning that not every gift comes with a hidden blade." Mira, too, had softened considerably in her manner toward Chaol, though she would never fully abandon her sharp, watchful nature. She still oversaw the Omega quarters with the same brisk efficiency she always had, but Chaol noticed, now, a certain warmth in the way she checked on him each morning, a genuine care hidden beneath her stern exterior that he suspected had been there all along, simply waiting for a reason to show itself. General Corrin remained a steady, protective presence throughout the palace, his loyalty to Draven unwavering, though he had come, over the months, to extend that same fierce loyalty toward Chaol as well. It was Corrin who first suggested, quietly and without ceremony, that perhaps it was time the court recognized formally what everyone within the palace walls already understood plainly. Draven raised the matter himself one evening in early winter, as snow fell softly outside the chamber window, and the fire crackled warm and steady beside the great bed they now shared without hesitation. "I've spoken with my advisors," he said, an unfamiliar nervousness in his voice that Chaol found strangely endearing, on a man so commanding in every other aspect of his life, "about formally naming you as my chosen companion, rather than simply the bed Omega tradition demanded I keep in residence. It would mean a title, responsibilities within the court, a permanent place here, beside me, should you want it." Chaol's breath caught, though not from fear this time, but from something far warmer spreading through his chest. "Is that what you want?" "It's what I want more than anything," Draven admitted, taking Chaol's hands in his own. "I spent 3 years believing I had lost the capacity to trust anyone with my heart again. You didn't force your way past those walls, Chaol. You simply waited on the other side of a door I was too afraid to open, patient enough to let me find my own way through it. I don't want to spend another single night without you fully beside me, not standing guard outside, not waiting alone within, but simply together, as we've become." Cale did not need to consider his answer. It had been building quietly within him for months now, through every shared cup of tea, every hesitant conversation through a wooden door, every small kindness exchanged between two people learning, slowly and carefully, how to trust again after everything life had taken from them both. "Yes," he said simply, and the word carried within it every quiet hope he had gathered since that first frightened night he had sat alone in this very bed, warming sheets for a king he believed had forgotten he existed at all. The formal ceremony took place at the first thaw of spring, modest by royal standards but filled with a genuine warmth that the grand halls of Ashvale had not witnessed in many years. Cale's family attended, his mother weeping openly with joy, rather than the resigned sorrow that had marked their final goodbye so many months before. His younger sister finally learning the truth of where her brother had gone, and finding in that truth not tragedy, but the beginning of something remarkable. That night, as the celebrations quieted and the palace settled into peaceful stillness, Cale and Draven retired together, to the chamber that had once held only cold silence and an empty, untouched bed. The fire burned warm beside them. The wine sat poured and shared between two cups rather than one left, waiting in vain. And outside the door, for the first time since Cale had first arrived within these walls, no guard stood watch through the long hours of the night, because the king no longer needed to guard a door he had finally, fully, walked through. Cale fell asleep that night with his head resting against Draven's chest, listening to the steady, unguarded rhythm of a heart that had once been too broken to trust anyone at all, and understanding, with quiet certainty, that whatever challenges still lay ahead for them both, they would face every single one of them together, in the same bed, behind the same door, with nothing left standing between them at all. The end.